The string quartet at my brother's wedding never missed a beat, but the only thing I could hear was the pulsing in my ears after my father's hand cracked across my face. 200 guests froze, champagne glasses hovering midair, the silence broken only by the echo in a grand ballroom I had spent 2 years meticulously restoring to its former glory. Have you ever poured your entire soul into building something beautiful only to have the people who should have been your biggest cheerleaders try to tear it all down in a single, brutal moment? My cheek burned with humiliation. But as I met my father's furious gaze, a strange calmness washed over me. He had no idea that with that one slap, he hadn't just embarrassed me, he had set me free. Before I dive into my story, I'd really appreciate it if you could let me know where you're watching from in the comments, and if you'd consider subscribing to my channel. It would mean the world to me and help me keep sharing more stories like this. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Ava, and the story of how I lost my family truly began under the soft glow of a crystal chandelier I had personally sourced from a restorationist in Prague. It was hanging in the grand ballroom of the Vanderbilt Hotel, a Gilded Age marvel I had spent 2 years of my life breathing back into existence. Now, it was the venue for my younger brother Leo's wedding, an event of breathtaking opulence that I, ironically, had made possible. I watched from my seat in the second row as Leo and his bride, Sophie, shared their first dance, moving like figures in a snow globe under the glittering lights. I had given a heartfelt, if carefully worded, toast just an hour earlier. Speaking of the importance of building lives on strong foundations, a subtle jab only I could appreciate. Knowing the ground my own family stood on was nothing but sand. During the cocktail hour, my parents found me. I was admiring an ice sculpture of a swan when my mother, Eleanor, touched my arm, her smile as sweet as the lilies arranged on the tables, but her eyes holding the familiar chill of a transaction about to take place. My father, Richard, stood beside her, straightening his bow tie with an air of self-importance. They guided me behind a large silk screen embroidered with peacocks, the celebratory noise of the party suddenly muffled. My mother's grip on her champagne flute tightened, her knuckles white. "Ava, darling," she began, her voice a honeyed whisper. "Your father and I need to discuss something with you. It's about Leo and Sophie." My father cleared his throat. Taking over. They need a proper place to start their lives after the honeymoon, a place to build a family. He paused, letting the statement hang in the air before delivering the payload. "Your penthouse, it's far too large for just one person. And it's time you did something truly significant for this family." I laughed, a short, sharp sound of disbelief. It had to be a joke, a poorly timed, bizarre attempt at humor. Very funny. "Dad, you almost had me." But his face remained a mask of stern seriousness. That's when my mother's hand clamped down on my wrist, her manicured nails digging into my skin. "We aren't joking, Ava. We've already promised it to them. Don't be selfish. Family comes first." The words hit me like stones. The penthouse wasn't just an apartment. It was the entire top floor of the historic Blackwood building, a 1920s Art Deco masterpiece I had rescued from demolition. I had poured my own money, my own sweat, my own soul into its restoration. It was my home, my sanctuary, and my greatest professional achievement. "That penthouse is mine," I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "I worked for it. I paid for it. I'm not just giving it away because Leo can't be bothered to afford his own home." My father's face flushed a deep, dangerous red, matching the Cabernet in his glass. He took a step closer, his presence looming over me. "After everything we've done for you, this is how you repay us." "Done for me?" The words escaped me in a bitter laugh. "I worked 3 jobs to put myself through architecture school while you paid every penny of Leo's business degree. I lived in a mold-infested studio apartment for 5 years while you bought him a new car for graduation. What, exactly, have you ever done for me?" That's when my mother began to cry, the practiced, silent tears of a martyr. "Oh, Ava, don't be so cruel," she whispered. We had to remortgage our house to pay for this wedding. To give your brother the start he deserves after his business failed. We invested everything in him. Now, it's your turn to invest in this family. This is how you pay us back." It was no longer a request. It was an invoice for a debt I had never agreed to incur. I pulled my arm away from her, leaving pale crescent moons on my skin where her nails had been. "No," I said, the word feeling both small and monumental. "The answer is no." I turned and walked back into the reception, my heart pounding against my ribs. I could feel my father's rage following me like a physical presence. The tension was so thick the guests would smile at us, then let the smiles falter as they sensed the storm brewing between us. The moment came during my father's speech. He stood, champagne glass held high, praising his perfect son, his voice booming with pride. Then his gaze found me across the room, and his expression hardened. "Most of us in this family understand sacrifice," he said, his voice dripping with insinuation. "We understand putting the needs of others before our own. But some of us," he pointed his finger directly at me, his hand trembling with fury, "have forgotten what it means to be part of a family." The humiliation was a physical blow. The room swam before my eyes. I couldn't take another second of it. I stood up to leave, my chair scraping loudly against the marble floor. That's when he moved. He strode toward me, and before I could react, his hand connected with my cheek. The crack echoed through the ballroom, louder than any note the string quartet had played all night. The music stopped. Every conversation died. In the ringing silence that followed, I heard someone gasp, and the distant shatter of a dropped glass. The side of my face was on fire, a branded, five-fingered mark of his rage. The metallic taste of blood filled my mouth where my teeth had cut the inside of my cheek. "Ava." Someone called my name, but I was already walking away, my heels clicking a steady, defiant rhythm against the floor, a sound that promised I would not be broken. That night, I sat in the dark of my penthouse, an ice pack pressed to my throbbing cheek, watching the city lights glitter like a sea of scattered diamonds. My home, my sanctuary, now felt like the scene of a crime. My phone buzzed incessantly on the marble countertop, a relentless stream of messages from shocked wedding guests and a few half-hearted, obligatory apologies from cousins. There was not a single word from my parents, nor from my brother, Leo. The silence from them was more damning than any angry text could have been. I finally turned the phone off, craving a silence that matched the one they had offered me. The next few days passed in a blur of work and a deep, gnawing ache that had little to do with the fading bruise on my face. The first direct assault came 3 days later. It wasn't a phone call or a text. It was a security alert on my phone while I was in a meeting with a client. "Motion detected living room." My blood ran cold. I excused myself and opened the security app, my hands shaking as I pulled up the live feed. And there they were. Leo and his new wife, Sophie, were standing in the middle of my living room as if they owned the place. Sophie was holding a tape measure, gesturing toward my floor-to-ceiling windows. "The new silk curtains will look divine here," she said, her voice tinny through the phone's speaker. Leo was panning his own phone around the room, a wide, smug grin on his face. He was filming. I watched, paralyzed with a mixture of rage and violation, as he popped a bottle of my best champagne, which he'd taken from my wine fridge. He raised the bottle to his phone's camera. "A little toast to our new home," he declared. "So blessed. Thanks to the best parents in the world for making it happen." A few seconds later, my phone buzzed with a notification from Instagram. He had posted it as a story. I clicked on it and saw the comments already rolling in from their friends. "OMG, congrats. The view is insane housewarming party when they hadn't just trespassed. They had publicly claimed my home, turning my life into a prop for their social media narrative. They had entered using a spare key I'd given my mother years ago for emergencies. A key she had clearly copied, turning an act of trust into a tool of betrayal. That was only the beginning. The next stage of their campaign was more insidious. My extended family, mobilized by my parents' version of the story, began a coordinated attack online. aunts and uncles started posting old, unflattering photos of me from my awkward teenage years, juxtaposing them with professionally shot engagement photos of Leo and Sophie. The captions were dripping with passive aggression. "So proud of our selfless Leo, who has always understood the importance of family," one aunt wrote. Another posted a picture of me with a bad perm at 15, captioning it, "Remembering when things were simpler, before all this success went to some people's heads. They were trying to erase the woman I had become and replace her with a caricature of an ungrateful, selfish daughter who had forgotten where she came from. Not one person asked me what happened. Not one person mentioned the slap. They had silently, unanimously, convicted me. The hurt was a constant, dull pressure beneath my ribs, but with each new post, each new violation, something inside me began to harden. The part of me that had always craved their approval was slowly dying, and in its place, something colder and stronger was growing my resolve. The daughter they knew, the one who would have eventually caved under the weight of guilt and pressure, was gone. She had walked out of that ballroom and never returned. I started meticulously documenting everything. I saved screenshots of the Instagram story and the passive-aggressive posts. I downloaded the security footage of the break-in. I recorded the increasingly hostile voicemails left by my father. I was no longer a participant in their drama. I was building a case. My best friend, Maya, who also happened to be one of the sharpest corporate lawyers in the city, sat on my sofa, reviewing the evidence I had collected. She pushed her glasses up her nose, her expression grim. "Ava, this is textbook harassment. The unauthorized entry alone is enough for a restraining order." I nodded, the thought of taking legal action against my own family making me feel sick, but also strangely powerful. "I hope it doesn't come to that," I said, though I was beginning to doubt it. They were escalating, convinced that if they just pushed hard enough, I would break. The final straw arrived via certified mail, a stiff, formal envelope that felt absurdly out of place. It was a letter drafted by some small-town lawyer, filled with laughable legal jargon. It claimed there was a verbal family agreement regarding the transfer of the property and that, due to their significant emotional and financial investments in my upbringing, they were entitled to this return. They were formally demanding I vacate the premises within 30 days. Maya laughed out loud when I read it to her. "They've got nothing," she said, "but you have to admire their commitment to the delusion." The letter was a declaration of war, and I knew then that I had to stop defending and start fighting back. What they didn't know was that while they were busy underestimating me, I had been quietly building an empire they couldn't even fathom. They saw me as a daughter who owed them, but the rest of the world was beginning to see me for who I truly was. My father, in his typical grandiose fashion, made the final move. He sent a text message to a group chat that included my entire extended family. "Family meeting at Ava's Penthouse, Friday at 7 p.m. to finalize the transfer. She will do the right thing. This matter is now closed." The audacity was breathtaking. He was summoning them to my home to witness my surrender. But for the first time since this ordeal began, I felt a profound sense of calm. The board was set. The pieces were in place. Game on. I whispered to my reflection, applying a touch of concealer to the last faint, yellowish trace of my father's handprint. Friday night arrived with a summer storm, rain lashing against my windows as if nature itself was setting the stage. At 7 o'clock sharp, my doorbell rang. I took a deep, steadying breath, smoothed down the front of my silk blouse, and opened the door. There they were, my parents, Leo and Sophie, aunts, uncles, cousins, a whole jury of my relatives, ready to pass judgment. My father held a manila envelope, undoubtedly containing his ridiculous agreement. My mother clutched a binder of paint swatches. Leo wore a smug smile that I suddenly had an overwhelming urge to wipe off his face. "Come in," I said, my voice even and pleasant. I stepped aside as they filed into my home, shaking off umbrellas and immediately starting to comment on the space, exclaiming over the view, already mentally rearranging my furniture. They saw this as a victory lap. They gathered in the center of the living room, an expectant and entitled flock. My father cleared his throat, ready to begin his sermon. Before we start, I interrupted calmly, I have a few guests of my own who will be joining us. I walked back to the door and opened it wider. Standing in the hallway were my lawyer, Maya, and an older, distinguished gentleman in a tailored suit they didn't recognize. My father scoffed. You can bring your fancy lawyer. Ava, it doesn't change a thing. This is a family matter. He patted the envelope in his hand. My mother added, Stop making a scene, darling. Let's just get this over with. Let me be perfectly clear, I said, my voice cutting through the room, suddenly devoid of the warmth they were used to. This isn't a discussion, it's a notification. I gestured to the older gentleman. I'd like to introduce you to Mr. David Miller. The name meant nothing to them. My father, ever impatient, waved a dismissive hand. Richard, perhaps you should let me finish. Mr. Miller said, his voice quiet but carrying an undeniable authority. I am the chairman of the city's Historical Preservation Committee. A flicker of confusion crossed my father's face. I continued, letting my words land slowly and deliberately. As Mr. Miller can confirm, the Blackwood Building is a protected historical landmark. The renovation plans you and Sophie were discussing in your Instagram story would be, among other things, illegal. Sophie's face went pale. Leo's smug smile faltered. But my father was still blustering. That's a technicality, a fine, it doesn't matter. He then turned his attention to me, puffing out his chest. You think this little stunt will stop us? I'm about to close on a major development project downtown. I'll be a very influential man in the city. A little historical committee won't stand in my way. He was trying to intimidate me, to remind me of his power. It was almost sad. Yes, I said, nodding slowly. The project in the old warehouse district, a very ambitious undertaking. It does, however, require the demolition of several protected facades, which means it needs final approval from the Historical Preservation Committee to proceed. I let the silence hang in the air for a moment before delivering the final, devastating blow. And as the newly appointed vice chair of that committee, I'll be the one personally reviewing your proposal next month. The proposal that the fate of your entire company depends on. The color drained from my father's face. My mother's hand flew to her pearls, her mouth opening and closing with no sound coming out. Leo looked as if he'd been struck by lightning. The power dynamic in the room didn't just shift, it shattered into a million pieces. The family matter had just collided with reality, and reality was not on their side. My father finally found his voice, a choked, spluttering whisper. You're bluffing! You wouldn't! I looked at him, at the man whose approval I had spent my entire life chasing, and I felt nothing but a cold, clear pity. I won't have to, I said quietly. At the hearing, I will simply recuse myself from the vote, citing a clear personal conflict of interest. I'll let your project be judged on its own merits, whatever they may be. That's what people with integrity do. The implication hung heavy in the air that they had none. I then turned to Maya, who handed out slim blue folders to my stunned family members. Inside, I explained, you will find a copy of the restraining order my attorney filed this morning, detailing the harassment and the unauthorized entry into my home. If any of you attempt to contact me, post about me, or come near my property or place of work after tonight, it will be enforced immediately. My mother finally broke, her voice trembling. Ava, you paid off our mortgage last year. You paid for Leo's student loans. We thought... I cut her off. Yes, I did. I did it quietly. Because I still believed you were my family, and that's what family does. You don't demand, you don't threaten, you just help. You stopped being my family the moment you decided my life was something you were entitled to plunder. I walked to the front door and held it open. This meeting is over. One by one, they filed out, their shoulders slumped in defeat. My father wouldn't look at me. My mother was openly weeping, her mascara running down her cheeks. Sophie paused at the door, the last to leave. I didn't know, she whispered, her eyes meeting mine for the first time with something other than disdain. About any of it. I'm sorry. It was the only genuine thing I had heard from any of them, but it was far too little, far too late. After they were gone, a profound quiet settled over the penthouse. The only sound, the gentle drumming of the rain against the glass. The storm outside had passed, and so had the one inside me. The next morning, I stood at my floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the city wake up. The sun glinted off the wet pavement, turning the streets into rivers of light for the first time in years. My shoulders felt lighter. The weight of their expectations, their disappointments, their endless needs was gone. That afternoon, I signed the papers to establish a new foundation, funded by a significant portion of my own earnings. A few months later, Architectural Digest ran a 10-page feature on the restoration of the Blackwood Building and my career. On the final page, there was a small, elegant announcement. It was for a new, prestigious grant for young restoration architects who were starting their careers without the benefit of family support. It was named the Leo and Sophie Foundation for New Beginnings. I had taken their names, the names of the people who tried to take everything from me, and attached them to an act of generosity forever. I didn't destroy them. I simply wrote them out of my story and began to build my own legacy on a foundation that no one could ever shake.